Welcome everyone to another episode of the Fire These Times. I'm your host Elia Ayoub, and today I'll be joined with Fabien, Nikesh Shukla, and Daniel Kurd. We don't quite know who is guest and who is host because it's just going to be a four-way conversation, I feel, on a topic that is dear to our hearts for very personal reasons, which is raising a brown child in today's world. The four of us are parents. My child is the youngest from what I can tell. We'll get into it more in details because there are like certain questions I feel like have been raised, have been in our minds. From what I can gather from the email I've exchanged with Nikesh, it's certainly your case as well, and I know from with my conversations with Fabien and Dana has also been the case. I will ask each of you to introduce yourselves in a sec. First, I'll ask listeners if you like this podcast and the projects associated with this podcast. You can join for as little as $5 a month on patreon.com/firethesetimes. And by doing so, you can basically help this thingy grow, as well as the other podcasts affiliated with the wider collective, which is called From the Periphery, which does not have a website yet, but will soon, including Obscuristan, Politically Depressed, and the upcoming podcast, Khida. By joining, you basically get an invite to join our monthly hangout, which is what it sounds like. A weekly Palestine watch party run by Ayman Makarim, the host of Politically Depressed and co-host of the Fire These Times, as well as an upcoming book club. In the first book, which is actually going to be Brown Baby, written by our guest Nikesh Shukla, and we'll talk more about the book obviously throughout the conversation, and I'll mention the book club more in detail at the end of this conversation. So to get this conversation kind of kick-started, let's start with some basic intros. I'm just going to start a bit randomly as you pop up on my screen. Nikesh, why don't you go first, and then Dana, and then Fabien.
Hello, I'm Nikesh Shukla. I am a writer, a parent, an idiot, and I wish my knees would still let me play football.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dana Al-Kurd. I'm a Palestinian researcher and writer, and I am a mom.
Hi, everyone. My name is Fabien. Nice to speak with you all. So I'm a human rights researcher, work with international NGOs, particularly at the moment researching human rights abuses in Europe, but having worked in other regions priorly. And I am British Mauritian, and I'm currently based in Marseille in France. And I'm also a parent, father to a young boy who's 2.5 years old now.
Okay. The thing we have in common, other than I think general political alignments and caring about human rights and stuff like that, the other thing we have in common is we're parents. My kid is very young, 6 months old as of a few days ago. Listeners who have listened to a few episodes would know the story by now, where she was born extremely prematurely on the 15th of October, and spent most of her life so far at the hospital, and thankfully for the past almost couple of months now has been at home. Everything's fine on that front, luckily, and so we're very grateful for that. And very much the elephant in the room in so many of my conversations with so many people these days, when it's not directly about that topic, is what's happening right now in Gaza, the ongoing genocide in Gaza. My kid her entire existence has so far been that. Of course, she doesn't know that, but she was born 1 week after the attack, and so obviously the war and the ongoing onslaught and everything had already started, and has only just gotten worse since. And the question of how will I even talk about this to her one day, the question also of when, and all of these things are obviously on my mind. I created lots of very dark associations in the early days of her existence, because as a micro-preemie, obviously she had to be in the incubator for, I don't even know how long now, a couple of months or so, no, a bit less. Let's say a month or a bit more than a month. And the image at the time when she was put in the incubator, which like from day one, the images coming from Gaza of the incubators there in one of the hospitals, I believe it was Shifa, kind of haunted me. Whenever I would go and see her, which was every single day, multiple times a day, these images were sort of in my mind. And I had to force myself, after some time, let's say, it wasn't straightforward, it still isn't, to compartmentalize a tiny bit and to have like, oh, this is my journalist hat on. this is my Palestinian hat on, and now I need to focus on my daughter in this very precarious situation hat on. And obviously has not been easy, but it's raised all of these questions of a tentative title of this episode. I don't know if I'll go with it because it might be too heavy for a title, but it's basically raising a brown child in a time of genocide. Because there are consequences to what's happening right now, not just in Gaza, obviously. It's just so many other conflicts that I can barely start scratching the surface, but Gaza is the one that's most directly impacting me, or at least my identity, my heritage, and of course Lebanon, because I grew up in Lebanon. Let me open up the floor to just have opening thoughts, reflections, and whatnot, because I know, as I said, from separate conversations I've had with you all, that this is something that's been on your mind.
I was literally just going to start to say it. I don't know how I'm going to make it through this episode. I was already really shocked, to be honest, just listening to you speak. And obviously, like you said, we've been having really regular conversations, and we've, from a distance, almost felt like part of the journey that you and your partner and your daughter have been through. And yeah, it's even just like starting this conversation, like I can already feel like the lump in my throat. And I literally don't know where to start, to be honest, because my kid is also too young to really grasp what I have any idea really what's happening. But yeah, almost every time I look at him, like there is just this background shadow of this reality of horror that's unfurling. We live in Europe. My family, our origins are not from Europe. They're from Africa, as I said, in Mauritius. Our background and our history, my family history, has always meant that, at least the way I was brought up, we saw other people's pain as our own, I think. It's just a sentiment or a feeling, or maybe I don't know if it's a value. I don't think I'd call it that, but it's definitely something that I felt growing up. And so when I see so much pain and devastation in Gaza, in Sudan, and like I said, so many conflicts in Congo as well, it's just impossible since becoming a parent, at least for me, not to see it through the lens of my child's eyes, and not to feel the fear, I think, that any parent must experience going through such horrors.
Yeah, I think the conversation is very heavy for me as well. As I mentioned, I am Palestinian, so this is all very close to me. But I agree with Fabien that like ever since I became a parent, seeing any kind of suffering does impact me a lot, and affects my mental health, and affects my psyche. And this last couple of months has been really, really difficult. It's a very strange level of compartmentalization that we're expected to undertake as brown parents in the global north. Check in the morning, read the news, see devastating numbers, and parents publicly mourning their children, and so much sadness, and then compartmentalize and go about your day. And I'm getting worse at it. It's very clear I am unable to engage in the same way. It's bled into my ability to engage in any of my relationships, including with my child, and comes out in strange ways. At one point, my child was sick in the last couple of weeks, and I heard myself say, children in Gaza don't have medicine. It's like the child doesn't understand what I'm saying, of course, but it's coming out in these strange ways, and it's very hard to cope. And then for me, also being a Palestinian in the United States, and with all of this backlash against Palestinians, truly unprecedented level of backlash from our elite captured system, where I'm starting to wonder what future we have really in this country. And that's a whole level of stress and anxiety for me, that I don't know where to take my half Palestinian baby. I don't know where to take this child to keep them safe somewhere in the world. Disconcerting is too light a word to describe kind of my mental state on this question. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it there. But
Yeah, just echoing what Dana and Fabien were saying, and what you were saying earlier. It's really hard to kind of make sense of your place in the world, and watching on social media picture after picture after picture of children in rubble, children without parents, children, with horrific injuries, and it kind of gives you this real helplessness. There were times in the night in the last couple of months where I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I kept hearing in the middle of the night the phone call that Hind Rajab was making to that Red Crescent worker. I was haunted by that story. And obviously there is that sort of familiarity thing of like I looked at pictures of her and I saw my children. And what's been interesting for me at this time, what's been comforting for me at this time is being able to have these knotty conversations with my kids about what's going on in the world and be able to explain it to them without kind of projecting my own weariness or sadness or cynicism or whatever negative feelings, but just sort of present to them what's going on and they understand that things are not right. I really remember Christmas Day, my partner wasn't very well, and so we had to change some plans, and we were walking through the park. I took the kids out to get some fresh air, and we were walking through the park, and my eldest child was upset because plans were changing because it was Christmas Day, and it's a special time for her, and I sort of said, the kids in Gaza don't have Christmas Day. The first thing I'd seen that day was that the priest in the church in Jerusalem had sort of said that they wouldn't be celebrating Christmas. And I said, they're not celebrating Christmas. And hours after she was supposed to go to bed, this was like 11 o'clock at night, she came down the stairs and she was like, I just feel really, really sad that kids don't get to have this one day because of all this stuff going on. She was, and she was really upset. And my worry with talking to my kids about all this stuff is that you don't want to find out that your kids lack basic empathy skills. That would be really heartbreaking for me. But it's been very comforting in our little unit to kind of know that we can talk about what's going on in the world. And they do listen when the news bulletins come on the radio or whatever, and we can talk about stuff afterwards. And I'm really grateful for that because I grew up in an environment where my parents refused to talk about what was going on in the world with me and would much rather I just be in my little study hard box rather than engaged with the world events.
Yeah, I think we all have thoughts. Okay, so I relate to basically everything that's been said so far. I was born in 91 and the civil war in Lebanon ended, the civil war in quotation ended in 1990. And not too long ago, I discovered that my mom was pregnant with me when our childhood home was bombed by the Syrian regime at the time. And that was like towards the end of the war, or the wars as I usually call it. And so one thing led to another, probably in my subconscious, and I can't quite tell you exactly how, but I ended up, spending 6 years of my life doing a PhD on the post-war in Lebanon, trying to effectively understand what is this period that is called the post-war, that is basically my entire life, officially starting in 1990, like a year before I was born. What defines it? What is it? What is it about it that even makes it different than the war? And obviously the parallels here are not the same, but let's say for some reason, one way or another, this phase of the war, quote unquote, ends. What comes after? That for me is something that I'm kind of trying to understand, really, trying to not in the sense of trying to predict things because I can't. I'm now comparing everything to how my parents did things and the pros and cons. And Nikesh, you mentioned this a bit in actually in Brown Baby towards the end, if I remember correctly, that seeing them a bit more human after you start becoming a parent. It's a bit like that with me. I used to judge them more. I still resent certain things, but I, let's say, understand certain other things that I didn't want to understand before. I maybe didn't have space for before. But ultimately, that was a generation that the civil war, the Lebanese wars started when they were 15 and ended when they were 30, and they had me when they were 31. And so it's effectively their entire lives, really, in terms of like just being conscious human beings at the age of 15 onwards. I'm thinking a lot about this now, And the contrast that I have in mind, maybe then I'll leave it then to Dana, because otherwise I will ramble on. There's so many different threads I can go into here. But I knew Rifat a bit. We were like acquaintances at the time when that book compilation, Gaza Writes Back, I think it's called, came out. I was working for Global Voices and I was volunteering for them. And so we got in touch and we stayed in touch and just on and off. And the thing that haunts me, you mentioned that the call by, I believe her name was Hind, the girl. What haunts me is a conversation that Rifat had with Jake Harnahan from Popular Front, a podcast I was on in the past to talk about Lebanon. But I think his last interview, at least definitely one of the last. And in that interview, which is on Popular Front, for those who feel like they can listen to it or want to listen to it, everything is in the background. Like you could hear everything, the bombs, the screams of children, all of that stuff, just in the background. And Rifat somehow managing to, I'm not gonna say keep his composure. That's not whatever that even means, but clearly, obviously impacted by everything that's happening, but still trying to explain to Jake in that conversation like what is happening. And I think about that sometimes, just that putting different hats on, that even Rifat, who is in a situation that I had never been in, and hopefully never will be in, still felt that he had to put different hats on because probably otherwise he couldn't function at all as a human being. So I think about that a lot. It ties into a reflection, Fabien, you've had on how the book Brown Baby is almost as much about grief as it is about raising a kid and becoming a parent and so on, which we'll tie into in one way or another in this conversation. I just wanted to share that, yeah. And then I think you wanted to say something.
I'm just reflecting on this point that both of you mentioned about seeing parents in a different light, and Nikesh had said that like he's engaging with his children on some of these questions in a way that maybe his parents didn't. And I don't know what it is, but I mean, I was born in Jerusalem, and I was born at the middle towards the end of the first Intifada. Obviously, I don't have memories of that, but I do have some memories of the second Intifada. And of course, even between the Intifadas, like it wasn't a peaceful place. I saw military occupation. And then even when we moved away from Palestine, I feel like my parents weren't careful in some ways about what kinds of information I was exposed to. I mean, honestly, like Arabic news was blaring all the time. And as a young child, I was seeing things maybe I shouldn't have seen. So it's interesting that I've had this opposite reaction, especially to the recent events in Gaza, where I feel more panicked about keeping it from my child and more panicked about not exposing them to some of this information. It's not necessarily working because they did at one point in the back seat say to me, there's something bad happening in Gaza, right? And I was flabbergasted because I had never addressed the issue with them directly, but clearly they've been listening. Even if we're being very careful, it's interesting this level of engagement because I think it's very good, of course, to know what's happening around the world, but it's also, for me, it had growing up, it was such a psychological burden to understand yourself in this context, that you are a victim of racial abuse and that people don't want you to exist. And it impacted me in some positive ways and some negative ways. And so I've had just kind of a knee-jerk panicked reaction to try to keep, but I'm not suggesting that I'm correct and you all are wrong. That's not the case at all. You're probably right. It's just, this is my coping mechanism at the moment. It's just to like try to avoid the discussion.
Yeah, I don't think I'm right. To qualify what I said earlier, I actually had both reactions at the same time, depending on sometimes my judgment, if you want, of how certain things were growing up, is a bit like I'm more pissed off now than I used to be before. Certain things could have definitely been done differently. And other things like, oh, I'm more understanding, let's say. So it's actually both at the same time. You said you're born and raised in Jerusalem. I wasn't. My relationship to Palestine is I have a grandfather who passed away now, who was born and raised there and then was exiled. And so for me, the relationship that my kid will have is like, oh, my great grandfather in her case. was Palestinian, born and raised there, and then had to probably at some point learn about the Nakba and all of that stuff. I thought a lot about what is the ethical balance, if there even is one. Fabien and I had this conversation separately as well. Like even the naming of my kid, like which name to give her. Do I go with my family name, which is very Arab, or do I go with my partner's family name, which is very Italian? My kid is, at least as of now, like white passing. The first name can be both, like Arab and Italian. It was on purpose, of course. So there was a bit of that, and that's the link with grieving, because ultimately I felt that I had to erase a part of myself, a part of my heritage, part of my what I grew up with, and so on, because it can then become a burden on her. Theoretically, I would say, yes, everyone should have their culture. It should be passed on. It's an amazing and beautiful and wonderful thing, and I do believe that. But then there's this other side of me that's like, oh, is it even fair on her? Because did she ever choose that? Ultimately, I'm making a decision that's going to impact her in one way or another, obviously, regardless. That's just how it is, and we'll have to kind of live with that. But that's part of it. And my mind is like, well, should we teach her Arabic? I should just let's forget about it entirely and like reset the clock and whatnot. And I mean, we will, has been our conclusion, but it was one of the questions on our minds.
Yeah, just reflecting on what Daniel was saying about the difference in how you grew up and how I grew up, just to talk a little bit about, my dad grew up in Kenya when it was still under British rule and came to the UK in the 60s and came to a place where he was nearly murdered a couple of times by skinheads. And I think that just something like this protective switch went on in him, and he sort of bought into this real 80s Thatcherite British like lie about social mobility. If you work hard, then anything can happen for you. And I think my dad sort of really bought into that thing of being the model minority. And that, we've seen how like the limitations of representational politics in the UK and how that results in people like Rishi Sunak sort of helming some of the most regressive policies the UK has ever seen. We're talking today at the point at which he has announced that these deportation flights to Rwanda will happen in July and whatnot. And for my dad, looking at someone like Rishi Sunak, he's so proud that he's our prime minister. The only time my dad has ever mentioned racism to me is saying Rishi Sunak has suffered so much racism as prime minister, which I find really interesting. But I sort of like, I understand, but I don't understand why he kind of shielded us from a lot of this stuff, partly because like he changed. He became the type of person who really wanted to buy into that immigrant myth. The limitations of that just seem perplexing to me. I don't want my kid to sort of be put in that position. I've made some really stupid mistakes in talking to them about stuff that was slightly outside their realm of understanding of the world. Like there was this kind of thing where I'd walk them to school, and every time we walked past a police officer, I'd be like, "Oh, stay away from the police" or whatever. And it became this whole thing of like, "Daddy doesn't like the police." And one day they asked me, "Why don't you like the police?" And like trying to explain an abolitionist mindset to your children and trying to explain to them that you feel that society has been set up wrong in the UK to be punitive rather than whatever. And it was slightly beyond them. I think the thing that they've both really grasped onto, we've taken them on marches calling for a ceasefire or marches, um, pro-Palestine marches or whatever you want to call them. And, the thing that has really caught their sort of their empathy zones is like how many children are dying, how many children have become orphaned. The statistics around like life expectancy and how young the population is or was. I wrote Brown Baby at a different time to now. Like it sort of feels kind of banal to talk about some of the stuff that I write in Brown Baby within the context of what's happening in Gaza. But the sort of the central question I was trying to ask myself, which I suppose is an evergreen question, is like, how do we raise our children to be prepared for a fucked up world and also retain some sense of boundlessness and joy and wonder? I want my kids to be kind and I want them to be curious at a very, very basic level. And it's really hard when the world is telling them that society's not set up that way.
Can I share also that, like, I just want to be clear that I also think it has to do like where, you know, your particular child's age and temperament and things like this. And so like that really obviously drives a lot of those kinds of decisions at what point. But for me, I wish I could be more gradual about it. The world is forcing me not to be gradual about it, not to be so careful with my child because I know their temperament, I know their sensitivity. Unfortunately, the world is making me fast pace some of those conversations in a way. And I think that is what I'm afraid of because, like you said, like I want them to grow up whole and I want them to grow up with a sense that they can engage in the world fully. But it's like I'm just reflecting on like I don't do much correctly, but what I do correct is reading. And my child's library is fantastic. His at-home library. It's interesting because it's like I have no problem reading my child books about the civil rights era. Obviously, they're quite sanitized, so it's not showing police brutality. But the civil rights era, he's got a book about Lujain and Hazlul, and all of those things. But then I very, very clearly noticed the shift in his sadness and everything when I've read things about the Syrian civil war, for example. That haunted him. I was like, oh, okay, so this is the limit. And again, they're children's books. It's not like I'm reading things with great detail. So that's why with Gaza, it hits so much closer to home. We know we're Palestinian, and I'm so afraid. And this is something I need to figure out a strategy to pursue a more engaged approach and not cede that ground, but still keep their mental health safe in some ways.
The balance that you're all describing of trying to strike is almost the conversation which I have with myself almost every day, and it has been since my son was born, I'd say. Like Elia said, we've had discussions about when I read Brown Baby just recently. One of the things that really stood out to me or resonated with me, and a lot of it did resonate as a parent for sure, but was also how much was about grief. And so there was obviously just a connection of the fact that my father died more than a decade ago. Obviously, my son will never meet his grandfather on that side of his family. And then alongside grief, there's the element of trauma as well. And in terms of my own background, so my family is Creole Mauritian, which like very loosely you could describe as like Afro-descendant Mauritian. It's more complicated than that for the purpose of this discussion. I'll just summarize it that way. And there's this concept which is often challenged. So I don't want to give it too much credence, but this idea of what's often called la melaise Creole. Essentially, Creoles remain the most discriminated against group in Mauritius. That has been a persistent factor, dating back to the origins of slavery and then post-independence, the way that Mauritian society has been structured has perpetuated those legacies of slavery and ongoing discrimination. And like a small story from the literal birth of my son, when we were in the maternité, the ward, my son was born in Paris, and there was a nurse, and I remember saying to my partner, I know she's Mauritian. Like I could just spot, I just knew she was Mauritian. We didn't talk about it. Obviously, there was a lot going on, like literal many births happening in the wards. And when my son was like 2, 3 days old, she came into our room just to do a checkup, this nurse, and she just said a few words to me in Creole. And like, so she'd spotted that I was Mauritian, that my son was Mauritian, and she knew that I knew that she was Mauritian. And I typically am not like a flag waving person, but just, I don't know, in the chaos of before getting ready for the birth of my first kid, one of the things that did make it into the little suitcase we came was a little Mauritian flag. But generally, it was like, oh, will you take a picture with us with the Mauritian flag? And she'd been joking and laughed with us, and she just went like stone cold, and she was just like, no, I can't. And I realized immediately that basically I just triggered a very deep trauma in her. She, like many other Mauritians, was someone who'd left during much of the kind of chaos before independence, and she's never been back. And one of the things listening to you speak about how your parents had or did not have certain conversations with you, and when I try to think what conversations and how should I have them with my son, I don't know if it's a real separation or not. But this, I think, with my parents, they spoke what I would describe as the collective grief and traumas and inequalities that exist in our societies, but they didn't really ever talk about their own. And since becoming a parent, I can almost recognize it in certain decisions that they made. I realized that, oh, that's just something they weren't able to tap into. But that phrase that you used, Dan, about like psychological burden is definitely something I want my son to be proud of his heritage, to know about his heritage and how complex it is. But at the same time, like you said, the fact they're so prominent in my thoughts already, I'm always worried, am I going to overburden him so quickly when he's ready to discuss, when he shows curiosity about those elements? I don't, I know you, between the four of us, you were weighing up who's got the right approach. There is no right approach, I'm sure. And everything that all of you have been saying are just absolutely the same thoughts that I've been having as a parent. And yeah, I just hope to find the right balance to, like you said, raise a joyful, empathetic child. One thing I was curious to know whether this is something you've been feeling previously or in the past few months as well. But one thing I've noticed as a parent is feeling a lot of distance from other parents. Because I think, like you were saying, when the first thing you said, Dano, about reflecting on where you're raising your child, where is the right future for you? I know when I meet other parents, kind of in public groups or something like that, I can tell they're not having the same thoughts that we're having, basically. Like they may even have genuine sympathy, even empathy with what they're seeing on the news, but they don't take it to their home in a way. Obviously, they love their children and they empathize with the fear of your child being harmed in any way. I don't want to underestimate that at all. But it's not translating it into like these real life decisions of, can I raise my child, and can they thrive here, sort of thing? Can they be safe and can they thrive? And I don't know, one sentiment that I've definitely felt a lot in the past few months is this, yeah, kind of sense of distance from other parents where I can kind of palpably feel that they're not processing this in the same way that I think that all of you have described as well. I don't know if that's just a me thing, basically, or if that's something you're all feeling as well.
Not to dominate, but definitely. I couldn't really disentangle until you said it. I couldn't disentangle in my mind the last couple of months, whether it's like a depression thing, like I am depressed, and so maybe that creates tendencies to isolate, or it's this parenting thing, because in our social circles, we have befriended some parents with kids similar in age to my child, and I have had very little tolerance in the last couple of months for those conversations, to see those people. It's not fair. I understand. I know this is like somewhat a me problem. I can't stomach the Gaza as a footnote.
If I can add to that, as I mentioned, we spent like 3.5 months at the hospital between the NICU and a thing after the NICU. It doesn't matter. We saw a lot of other parents in similar situations, but also lots of nurses from different backgrounds. It's a public hospital, so a lot of immigrant backgrounds as well. And it was pretty obvious early on, not always, I mean, it is a broad generalization, but I can't say it's everyone necessarily. But there was a difference between how some nurses talk to us versus how some other nurses talk to us. With the exception of one nurse towards the end who said something explicitly racist, the others were more like tongue-tied, didn't know quite what to say, what to do. Maybe they were genuinely worried that they would hurt me or say something, misstep, they didn't know how to approach things and whatnot. What that translated into in a concrete way, let's say, is I kind of put my Arabness at the door before going to the hospital. It's a short walk between the hospital and the house. It became like a routine. I would go in the evening and then the morning and then the evening, and my partner would go during the day and so on. As it happens, I'm currently wearing a shirt that has Arabic on it. I would never do that going to the hospital. There's a blanket that a friend gave us that has like an Arabic poem on it, that was to put on my kid like in bed, like at the hospital, and I didn't do it. I didn't bring it. I couldn't. I was saturated. Like my mind could not handle more than what it was already handling. In the moment, it was like one day we'll deal with identity and whatnot. Now it's literally does not matter. She's a micro preemie. Like why would that even matter? And I'm not even saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's just how it was. But we absolutely noticed, both my partner and I, that there were some nurses who viewed me specifically differently, and by extension viewed my kid differently, in ways that I couldn't control. So it was just completely out of my control, and that was exhausting. That was exhausting because we were already both in emergency mode, like sleep deprived all the time, dealing with 2 dogs at home as well who were not used to the sudden change of things. And I was focused. I mean, with like I'm just gonna go there and be there for my kids, and then come back home, eat, and then do it again. That very, very specific tasks that are pretty straightforward, very easy to follow in many ways. Not much to do, especially in the early days, just being physically there. But that wasn't enough. I couldn't just be, and that's the thing that for me is partly about like grief as well, why I kind of identify with a number of the at least overall themes in Brown Baby and other texts, because I came to the book looking for something to relate to, really, because I live in Geneva. I'm very disconnected from my environment. There are a lot of assumptions and preconceptions and racism and all of that shit that I don't have the mental capacity to deal with most of the time. So frankly, I pretend it's not there, and when it's there, I pretend I'm not seeing it, or if I am seeing it, I kind of explode and I yell, and then I withdraw, and then I pretend not to see it for a few more weeks after that. Because you're not supposed to yell here about racism. You're supposed to send a note to the manager or something. That's just how it is. I'm saying all of this because the metaphor that's on my mind is I have, let's say, 2 big ass baggages that I'm carrying around with me, like just 2 huge luggage. At one point, I'll have to decide like which one of them, or both, or neither, am I passing on to my kid. Like she's gonna inherit this. And there are certain things that are gonna be fun to inherit. I have an early edition of Lord of the Rings that I'm super fond of because it was a book I loved growing up, and so she's gonna have this, and maybe she loves it, and maybe she doesn't, and she doesn't, I'll be heartbroken, but that's okay. Stuff like that are just more fun, laid back, makes it worthwhile in many ways. But then there's the other stuff. It's like she's gonna be talking to her grandparents, and her grandparents grew up in a war. How is this even gonna be brought up? Are they just gonna pretend it never happened? But if one day she finds out about it anyway, what will the questions be? How will they approach it? Are they even ready for it? All of that. So all of these are conversations that will probably have to happen in one way or another anyway. I'll stop on that actually. Dana, you mentioned other parents and other that parents as of now not as much of a thing yet because she's 6 months old and at home all the time. But other parents from the NICU, at the NICU, and as I said, other nurses that are more or less the same age group as we are. Many of them are also parents and whatnot. I couldn't not put a mask on when I was there. I was unable to be. I wasn't myself. I felt like myself was too much. If I was myself in that moment, I would depress the fuck out of them, scare them maybe. I don't know. All of the 10 different emotions could happen at any given time, and I have no way of knowing which ones. And I didn't have the mental space for it. I was just there for my kid. And that's something that's specific about like being a brown parent of a brown baby, I suppose, or at least in a racialized context.
It's very alienating.
A thing that I've noticed in things that you guys have all said, and I think probably I've said as well, is like a degree of guilt, or a degree of, not self-loathing is probably far too strong a word for what I'm trying to say, like a degree of guilt, a degree of shame about your place in the world and what that means for how you are as a parent. And I think like the hardest thing you can do is remember to show yourself some compassion, because these are incredibly strained times. You're not always going to be in the best possible place to do the stuff that you need to do with your kid, and that's okay. Like, kids move on. We've all probably had a go at our kids for doing something annoying when that's just annoyed us even more because we've been depressed or sad or stressed or anxious or whatever. I guess we just have to keep going, like keep showing ourselves enough compassion to go like we are fallible people and fallible people in difficult times trying to raise kids and stay above water is like it's draining, you know?
As you mentioned guilt, and I had a conversation with a good friend of mine, one of the namesakes for our son. He's someone that we respect and love dearly. He's in the diaspora. He's in based in the GCC at the moment, and we were having a conversation basically along exactly these lines. He started with the term guilt, like so. His second child, so his son, was born in August of last year. A similar timeline to your family, Elia. So what he said is, I think more than anything, the most overwhelming aspect of this whole situation, at least from a personal standpoint, was just the guilt. It's something I haven't felt as profoundly before being a parent. You know, we've gone through lots of rounds of aggression and violence against the Palestinians for as long as I can remember, but it definitely affected me in a much more emotional way. Both me and my partner are now that we're parents, because effectively we see our children, we see these kids. It's very complicated. It's something I haven't really felt before. It's in the little things, being able to hold my daughter, being able to hold my son, to hold them in my arms, and then juxtaposing that with the parents in Gaza and in the West Bank, for that matter, who can't protect their own children. It's a very difficult thing to even think about because as a parent, you're the protector, you're the guardian, you're the provider, you're also the rock. So having that taken away from you as parents is very, very devastating. It takes away your superpower, I guess, because as a parent, you're there for your kids through and through, no matter what happens. That could have been me. That literally could have been me if my parents hadn't fled in 1948 to the West Bank. My mum is originally from, but her town was ethnically cleansed and they fled to the West Bank. A lot of Palestinians ended up in Gaza, 70% are actually refugees in Gaza. So there's that sense that that literally could have been me. It just so happened that I got lucky and now my kids are lucky. And that's a combination of luck, privilege, and then the guilt sits in. I think for my partner, it's been even more emotional because she had literally just given birth to our son and she couldn't enjoy those moments of laughter, of being there for her son, of bonding with him, because effectively we were both just glued to the TV. I remember there would be times when she would be bawling her eyes out while breastfeeding our son, and it was just a very dark place to be. And obviously, again, this is nothing in comparison to what people are going through on the ground. I hope this just provides insight into what Palestinians in the diaspora are going through, because I feel like it's a collective grief. Even though we're not in Palestine, we are very much affected by it. Everyone is affected in different ways, and I think the guilt is definitely a common denominator for Palestinians in the diaspora, especially those in positions of privilege living out in the Gulf or in the US and Europe for that matter. I just felt I wanted to do justice to the sentiments that the friend had shared because they devastated me when I read them, and guilt was the kind of primary emotion that he was feeling. But exactly what you were saying, Nikesh, that even that friend and myself and my partner, and it's something that you talk about in Brown Baby, especially towards the end, it's just like joy, providing joy, cultivating joy. And I always have been increasingly see that really as an act of resistance as well as resilience. And that's really framing the parent that I want to be, that I hope to be. I know that I fall short of that a lot of the times. I just want that to be my driving force as a parent as much as possible, just to protect my kids' joy as much as possible.
Everything you said, I think I've literally said the same thing. The two people around me about feeling this guilt, and no matter how much you do, it's not enough. It's so strange to explain this to people, how your child's joy and seeing your child thriving is in fact very political because it combats erasure. I mean, obviously you care about the child in and of itself, but it's also a political project in raising these whole children in spite of everything is a way to fight back in some ways. Like we're doing that work in our parenting. For me, especially as a Palestinian, to combat erasure. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more. And there's a necessity to, I've noticed, even though, like I said, my son's 2.5 years old. And I've already picked up on lots of spaces where if I don't bring that kind of political act to ensure protecting his joy, he will be politicized by other people in the society, and he will be judged very quickly. And that so there is already a politicizing happening to my son, whether I like it or not. You know, I wish there was a better phrase for it, but we clearly literally have skin in the game already, and so I have no choice but to um, see his joy as politically and to protect it. Just as a kind of anecdote, as I said, I live in Marseille, in France. They're from a very racist country. On Thursdays, typically, I take my son to this. I guess it's like a state-run play group. I guess it's not a creche. Like parents can stay with the kids, but it's a space for parents and kids. Usually from the age of 0 to from newborns to the age of 3. Previously, my partner would take him there most of the time, so the people who work there recognize our son. I managed to kind of negotiate some time with work so that I could just have that time with him on Thursday morning. So I started going regularly, and there was this really strange experience I had where it was the second or third time where I'd gone like third week in a row or something like that. And so you have these they're not teachers, but it's kind of, I think some of them are child psychologists, educators of some sense. And I was just getting my son ready, like taking his shoes off, etc. And he was getting ready to go run around. And I just overheard this conversation. And it was one of those ones where you kind of like, I'm pretty sure they're talking about me and about my son. I might just be getting it wrong. And then I realized that they were talking about métis, in French meaning, it's a very complicated word again, but essentially meaning, kind of mixed race, etc. I realized that there was this kind of very twisted, very colonial praise happening where they were remarking on the fact that, oh, how wonderful it was that I was now bringing my son to this space. And they were remarking on that in the sense that his racialized, because my partner is white, his mother is white, and so they're like, oh, it's great that his dad is here, so, and then they were clearly saying that, oh, it's great that well, they weren't using this term, but like I'd say the racialized side of his identity is present and is part of his upbringing. And then I could hear that the conversation then went into talking about gangs and them saying, because otherwise there's this void of identity, and that's how they get pulled into gangs and blah, blah, blah. I was just sitting there, just doing like this menial task of like, undoing my son's shoelaces. I realized this is how they perceive my son, this is how they perceive me. And it just absolutely spun my brain. And I had to just kind of like do that compartmentalization, kind of lock off the rage in my head and absolutely questioning myself if I'd really heard what I'd kind of heard in the background, and then just focusing on just making sure my son had fun and in this space. And then I just came home and spoke to my partner about it, spoke to other racialized parents we have, and they were like, no, that's definitely what happened. We know that stuff happens a lot in France. It was exactly that point that you were saying, Dana, that we have to fight back, and I have no kind of choice not to, because if I don't, other people are going to label and prejudge him in a very kind of political sense.
France is so racist. It's so, I have to say it.
I had so Fabien had told me the story like at some point in the past, because I forgot who I shared first, but I had an experience that I guess similar in essence, although it wasn't quite that. But one of the nurses at the hospital, my partner, my wife, had gone the day or the morning off, and I had gone the afternoon or something like that. And she asked my wife, "Do you have to be veiled? Will your husband ask you to be veiled or something like that?" And it's in that moment that I remembered again that A, I'm perceived to be Muslim, even though I'm not, and B, I'm of course perceived to be a very conservative Muslim, even though I'm neither of the two. That just precedes me, right? Like it's those moments that I'm kind of, again, it's not that I'm in denial of it. I'm very well aware of it intellectually, but in order for me to kind of function, for lack of a better term, emotionally, I kind of keep it at bay at times, the realization of it, especially if I have to do something else that's more important. which in this case it would be like caring for my kid. There were concrete consequences to that being the comments, other than like, oh, you can just, oh, she's an old white lady with bigoted views and whatnot, and Dana, she is French, if that helps. But there were consequences because the nurses and the evaluations determined when our kid would come home. And so in my mind, I was like, is this the moment to challenge white supremacy? And maybe this leads to my kid not coming home for an extra week or so. Like, I couldn't know. There was no way for me to know. And it's not like it's in, the guidebook that they give you or anything like that. You just have to figure it out on the spot. And it's one of those institutions that, quote unquote, doesn't see color, and therefore doesn't know where to look, rather, if you see what I mean. So there's that. I have other things I want to share, but I'm mindful of time. Brown Baby, actually, the book, is named after a song. There's a song called Brown Baby by Oscar Brown Jr. or Oscar Jr. Brown, I don't know. Most, I guess, famously performed by Nina Simone. Nina Simone is one of my two favorite humans, alongside Baldwin. This podcast is named after one of his books, of course. And the photo of the two of them together is basically my background on all devices. And in that song, I think it's the first paragraph, I wrote it down. She's saying, like, brown baby, as you grow up, I want you to drink from the plenty cup. I want you to stand up tall and proud, and I want you to speak up clear and loud. I want you to drink from the plenty cup, for me, is fascinating. For me, I interpret it as like, I know that I live in a world of precarity. I know that I've had to make decisions and choices that are not fair. And I will hopefully one day, kind of this inshallah in song, you wouldn't have to do that. Maybe you have other things to worry about or whatnot, but not the specific thing, because it's fundamentally unfair. That's the whole baggage thing I'm thinking about. Like, how much of it is it mine to deal with and maybe pass on, in the sense of like explaining it to her one day, and how much of it is mine to deal with and passing it on, but like, hey, here you go, now it's yours. That's the thing that I'm obviously very early on for me right now, but like, that's the thing that's on my mind in any case. Nikesh?
Can I share a story that might speak to that? I don't know if this
Yeah.
is helpful. I live in Bristol in the UK, the People's Republic of Bristol, which I guess is most internationally known for, during the pandemic, during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. A bunch of protests pulled down a statue of a slave owner called Colston, whose name adorns many things in our city. And there's a statue right in the center of the city that there's been an ongoing conversation about tearing it down since around the time it was put up, interestingly enough. And then finally in 2020, it was taken down and thrown in the river. My kid's school's name has an association with Colston, and the faculty wanted to engage the kids in a conversation about what that association meant going forward, as especially given that the majority of the school is brown kids and black kids. And my daughter came home one day and she was talking about how they were going to keep the name of the school, but they were going to change the association away from Edward Colston. And then she asked me about the Bristol bus boycott, which in the 1960s in Bristol was this big civil rights action where black people weren't being employed by the bus company because of the color of their skin. And so there was a big boycott of the buses that led to the bus company nearly going bust. His big civil rights thing in the city. And so she was asking me about it because I'd been talking about it in school. And I realized, in having to explain it to her, I'd have to explain to her what racism was. Typical of my child, this conversation is happening at the end of the day. She's getting out of the bath. I'm drying her. We're getting her pajamas on. We're getting her ready for bed. And she wants to know about racism. So I'm talking to her about what racism is. And halfway through the conversation, I realized this is a really hard concept to bring up. And so really distracted. I said to her, like, racism is when someone will treat someone else differently because of the color of their skin. This was, 2-3 years ago, so she was a lot younger, and I was trying to explain it as simply as I could. And she said to me, that doesn't make any sense. that doesn't make any sense to me. That sounds stupid. That sounds really stupid. And I started to go, well, people might be racist because, and then I realized that I was trying to justify racism to her in order to explain it when actually I needed to be on her level. And to be on her level is to take it for what it is and go, it's stupid. And that really kind of clarified it for me how to have these conversations, because so often you bring too much of yourself to the conversation and not enough of where they're at. And there are ways of talking about what's going on in the world on their level that kind of strip away your weariness, that strip away your pain and strip away your grief and all the rest of it. And that's what they need, someone to kind of go, this is the world as you see it. We'll complicate it as you get older. But right now, you're right, racism is pretty stupid. Um, and that was really helpful. And, that kind of way of approaching the conversation really helped when then we needed to talk to our kids about what was happening in Gaza, because we were able to kind of go, does this feel fair? And based on their conception as well, they were like, no, this doesn't feel fair. I've just been very entertained by by this whole tableau. It's been a glorious thing to watch.
For those listeners, we have Dana's kid who's just popping up on the screen and showing us random things. Unfortunately, we do have to stop talking at some point because that's how podcasts work. I'll mention a couple of things. I'll end, as I said earlier, with the book club announcement. Actually, let me do it now quickly. I'll get it out of the way. We'll soon start, as part of the Friday's Times, a book club on for Patreon supporters. We're not super strict about that. It can be Patreon +1. It's fine. The first book is going to be Nikesh's book, Brown Baby, because I've just finished reading it and I want to talk about it. And my memory is not very long. A book club, we'll probably call it From the Periphery Book Club, which is, as I said, the broader collective, which as of now does not have a website yet, but will at some point in the near future. I'll link the book, in the description, in the show notes. Folks who are interested in it are welcome, of course, to join on the Patreon, and Nikesh will join us at some point as well for one of the sessions. We'll organize this properly at some point. Kind of the hopeful note, I guess, for me. I'll try and do that because it's kind of good practice for a podcast to end on a hopeful note, I guess. And that's going to be me. And then I'll ask each of you to end on, whatever note. It does not have to be hopeful, on whatever note you want to end on. But for me, it's, as I mentioned, I'm really grateful for Nina Simone's work and for James Baldwin's work and so many other people's work. It took me some time, I guess a few years ago, really. I've been listening to her songs, for example, for much longer than just a few years ago, but to really understand certain things didn't quite happen before reading Baldwin. Back when I was still living in London, I attended this course called The Amazing James Baldwin at, I'm forgetting the name now, but something in the Black Cultural Archive, somewhere in southern London. I don't remember where.
In Brixton.
In Brixton, thank you, Fabien. Yeah. It's an amazing course. Both my partner and I attended. It was at a time when that documentary by Raoul Peck was kind of popular on James Baldwin. I was so impacted just by the scenes in that documentary that I ended up kind of consuming anything and everything Baldwin, especially video. I would just watch a bunch of stuff on YouTube because he has this presence that I found very, I don't know what the term is, just impressed, I guess. It just marked me very deeply because he had this framing, which really to this day is something I take to heart and in many ways inspired this entire thing. As I said, the name of the podcast is named after the fire next time, and so on, which is when he was talking to white people specifically and saying I am not the N-word. I've never been the N-word. You created that category. I'm paraphrasing here. He says it much more eloquently, but you created all of that. And so now I give it back to you. It is your burden. You have to figure out why you had to create the N-word in the first place. And I found that very liberating, that realization that he had. I felt almost I felt liberated by proxy just about hearing it. I'm not a Black person and I didn't grow up in the US. I don't have that experience. But just the fact that for me is whatever I'm kind of going through mentally, he just objectively went through something much worse multiple times. And of course he's written about it, but he still had that perspective, which is not just a perspective of we can come together, we should all just love one another, all of that, but actually it's a righteous anger at the state of the world, because To quote your kid, Nikesh, this is stupid. This thing is just dumb. And the world we live in many ways, is just nonsensical, and it doesn't have to be this way. And there is a bit of a, for me anyway, like a sense of, it's like a bit freeing in many ways to understand that this world is created by humans and it can be created differently. Like social construct basically can be constructed differently. That allows me some solace, at least from time to time. Not necessarily because it might free me, let's say, or not necessarily because I might experience the fruits of that freedom, let's say, but that it's very clearly a possibility. It's not just like some religious dogma or whatnot, because you can trace the roots of when this ism started, capitalism, patriarchy, racism, whatever. You can trace to when it started, more or less. So it's just logical to conclude that at some point it's going to end as well. And for me, it's not like I'm preparing myself for what comes after, because I may not live to see it. But I'm trying as much as I can, when I'm managed, when my mindset allows me to do so, when I'm being optimistic, let's say, I'm being joyful and hopeful and whatnot, to live as if it's already the case. Let's say, treat my kid as if there is no such thing as patriarchy, as if we have already overcome it, assuming I can even do that, but trying to do that. That's kind of what I take from all of this, and so I'll end on that personally.
Again, to share a very brief anecdote from the first time my mum met her grandson, my son. I had this really vivid memory of her cradling him and singing a song which is called Tikreol. It's a kind of Mauritian folk song. And it was the first time I kind of really listened to the lyrics, because it's a really sad song in some ways. It talks about a kid going to school speaking Creole, kind of lingua franca, in school, and being told you can't speak that language because you have to be French or English, blah blah blah. And thinking that's quite sad, but then finding the moment very beautiful as well, because then the chorus is almost like the child affirming you're Creole, I'm Creole, and affirming their identity as such and their part in that lineage. And I guess, I don't know why, but that memory also, to me, it speaks to just finding beauty in those connections. And that's how I think about Gaza. That's how I think about a lot of the suffering in the world. For me, I did grow up in a family that did kind of talk about politics quite a lot. And rightly or wrongly, I do feel empowered, or just a certain resilience came with that. And I don't know how I'm quite going to deal with it with my own son, but I do hope that he sees that our history is connected with all other oppressed people in the world. And for me, at least, that saves me from despair, because then I feel connection to other humans, and I know that I can be part of affirming other people's humanity as well. And I hope that he can feel that as well, in a hopeful and positive and joyful way.
Speaking of James Baldwin, but also just to say that part of the reason for writing Brown Baby was we found out we were having a kid, and I turned to Baldwin, as I often do, and read The Fire Next Time. And then I read Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I read I've Been Meaning to Tell You by David Cherry-Andrew, and I read Dear Girls by Ali Wong. They were all a comfort, but I wanted to read something a little bit closer to home. And so often when you begin a writing project, it's to fill a gap on your bookshelf. And thank you for inviting me on this podcast. It feels sort of strange for me to kind of talk about a book that I wrote before the pandemic at this specific time. If I was to write it again now, I'd write a completely different book. But as you were talking, Elia, it reminded me of that Baldwin quote: "The children are always ours, every single one of them, all over the globe. And I'm beginning to suspect that whoever is incapable of recognizing this may also be incapable of morality." I'd also just like to really recommend a couple of books that I think are phenomenal about the weight of parenthood in a political time. And they're both by Valeria Luiselli. It's a fiction novel called Lost Children Archive, which is all about a road trip that she takes with her kids. But it's inspired by her time acting as a Spanish to English translator for young children who are being separated from their parents at the Mexico-America border. during her time as a translator, she had to sit with these kids and make them fill out a 40-question form that was quite arresting and quite confronting. And she sort of was appalled that she was having to ask these children these really, really personal questions about whether they'd been abused or whether they'd witnessed violence. And these children just wanted to know where their mums and dads were. And she wrote a non-fiction essay about it called Tell Me How This Ends, an essay in 40 questions. And it's just one of the best books I've ever read about the weight of parenthood, because she wrote it at a time when she had not long become a parent, and she was sort of questioning whether she still wanted to write, whether writing was useful. And so she went and did this thing and then wrote two of the best books that I've read ever immediately afterwards. But yeah, thank you for having me, and love to all of you.
Thanks, Nikesh. Dana?
I mean, I feel like that was a really good ending point. What gives me hope is witnessing Palestinian mothers. Just simply that we can still try to take care of their children in a moment like this has been really awe-inspiring to witness. And a recommendation I have for those with little ones is a book called Homeland, My Father Dreams of Palestine by Hannah Moshevik. Really lovely book, age appropriate, 5-6 years old. Yeah, thank you for having me on this conversation.
All right. Thank you, everyone. This has been another episode of the Fire These Times. If you like this podcast, please consider leaving a 5-star rating or review on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. And if you really like this podcast, head on to patreon.com/firethesetimes. That's patreon.com/firethesetimes. The Fire These Times is a media ecosystem based in the periphery that supports a bunch of media projects, including this one. For $5 a month, and even less if you opt for the yearly subscription, you can help this ecosystem grow and get early access to all episodes of the Fire These Times, Politically Depressed, Obscuristan, and Khida, as well as an invitation to join our monthly hangout, watch parties, upcoming book club, as well as exclusive episodes. Thank you for listening, and take care, everyone.